is what's currently in place, the areas and gaps where we see there's need for improvement, and it's really just so that legislation to be, to move to a point where it leads to less indecision with regards to decommissioning throughout Trinidad and Tobago. So as I mentioned, essentially what we're going to be looking at today, we're going to look at the national framework that's in place at this current juncture. We'll also take into consideration the regional framework, and these can vary from legislation to regulation to bills and acts that have been passed throughout our history of oil and gas operation. When you look at the international frameworks, which really matters significantly to our jurisdiction. In addition to that, we're going to look at areas of review for improvement, and then essentially what a decommissioning work breakdown structure will look like with regards to the removal of offshore assets, subsea assets, pipelines, etc. So just to jump right into it, the activity of decommissioning has really begun to take shape on an international level. Primarily, we've seen major operators throughout the Northeast Atlantic, primarily in North Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and in Australia, engage in various degrees of decommissioning activity. And the trend is expected to continue throughout the following years. Now, this is a constant debate between what's happening with oil prices, what's happening with a lot of people are speaking towards peak oil. So there's always that gray area as to when to decommission an asset. On a national level, however, we continue to use assets well over 35 years of operation, and I'm certain you all are very familiar with the teak salmon Pui assets, which has been in commission, I believe, from 1974, to continue to be used up to today. And also, in addition to that, there are also redundant offshore installations that we haven't seriously addressed to date. So the real question around responsibility and accountability for decommissioning of legacy assets, legacy and derelict assets, coupled with the need for robust regulatory framework, should be main paramount. And that is essentially what we're here to discuss, really just to build the building blocks around these type of discussions with our regulators. So our current framework in Trinidad and Tobago, we have a couple well-established documents that's currently in use. We have the Petroleum Act 1969. We have the procedures for plugging and abandonment of oil and gas wells, developed in 1999. We have a shipping bill 2020, which is, I have this highlighted in green because this is fairly new legislation. It's a reworking of the old Marine Act, I believe it is, and it's fairly robust in what it wants to highlight. And I'm glad that we're moving towards this direction with regards to how we look at certain assets on offshore assets and pipelines. We have the Environmental Management Act, and also we have the production sharing and petroleum rights licenses that's distributed from the regulator to our multinationals and to our local entities that are involved in oil and gas operations. So essentially, our work breakdown structure and the way we're looking at it, the work breakdown structure has different segments that will speak towards the entire decommissioning process. And each one of these segments have a related act or regulation as to what is done for each area of a decommissioning program. From the start, from the top, we have the operators, project management and facility running of the owner's course. And that essentially falls under the realm of the Petroleum Act and our production sharing contracts. We have well abandonment, which again, falls into similarly into the Petroleum Act and the PSCs, in addition to the well plugging and abandonment approved procedure. We have facilities, pipeline making safe. So that primarily falls in the area of the International Marine Organization, IMO, and those international regulations speak specifically to some pipelines and to some offshore assets. And then we also have our shipping bill, which makes mention of the removal of offshore infrastructure in addition to pipelines. We have also, following that, looking at the breakdown structure, we now jump into topside preparation, topside removal, subsea removal, and topside substructure and onshore recycling. All these more or less can be encapsulated within the shipping bill. Now, the shipping bill, which we're going to get further deeper detail into, has very specific, they're very pointed in regards to prosecution. And I think it's really, it is more or less the big stick to beat over the operators back as to, hey, if things aren't done according to some regulation or to some requirements, you are then faced with particular fines. Then we have the subsea infrastructure, which includes our pipelines, our umbilicals, our mattresses, and our valves and other infrastructure that we may have on the subsea. And that also speaks towards, that's also encapsulated within the shipping bill. And then our final area is the site remediation and monitoring, which really has no guidelines and regulations. However, there is some mention of it and some area for that within our Environmental and Management Act. So our Petroleum Act, established in 1969, has fairly limited vocabulary as it relates to decommissioning and the removal of offshore installations. This is inclusive of subsea infrastructure, pipelines, cutting piles, seabed infrastructure, and post-decommissioning monitoring. It does, however, make reference to the submarine area. It's a jargon that is used within the Act, and that is as a representation of subsea operations. However, there is some mention of borehole and well abandonment processes, which is required to be approved by the ministry before commencement of any abandonment process. So our Petroleum Act, as it stands on its own, lacks significant robust rhetoric as it pertains to decommissioning. The well plugging and abandonment procedure. Now, this has been established previous as a spin-off of the Petroleum Act of 1962 and our Petroleum Regulations of 1970. The minimum requirements for plugging and abandonment of offshore and onshore wells and boreholes is what this procedure is primarily focused on. It goes plugging and abandonment operations must not commence without the approval of the Ministry of Energy, which is paramount across any industry across the world. Specifications for permanent abandonment, temporary abandonment, and abandonment of zones during recompletion have all been detailed at a fairly high level throughout the well plugging and abandonment procedure. However, this procedure would have been done, I think it was most recently completed in 1999. So there's always areas where improvements can come around, and based on studies and based on new tests and new technology, there are certain things that can be put in place. Currently, it's operated under the standard American API RP of 57, first edition, which was established in 1986. And over this protocol has further been developed over the years. And there are new, as I mentioned before, there are new areas where we believe that well plugging and abandonment can go towards as it is right now with regards to new technologies and new approaches to completing that procedure. So I would have mentioned the shipping bill 2020. So this is currently it's to be discussed and debated in Parliament. So it's still a work in progress, as in this is not enacted at this point in time. But the necessary stakeholders are reviewing this bill, and it's obviously a bill it falls under the Transport Division of Trinidad and Tobago, the Ministry of Transport, that is, ironically enough. But there are obviously significant impacts on the oil and gas industry. So it's a new act addressing offshore installation penalties and fines, and this is for offshore installations as it relates to Trinidad and Tobago, where we have some fixed platforms, compliance towers, which don't really apply to us. We have semi-submersibles, jackups. We have seen some drill ships off our coast over the last couple of years. Obviously, taking into consideration that we have Guyana fairly nearby, that they have been using a lot of drill ships over on that side. Floating production platforms, tension leg platforms, and gravity-based structures, which we don't necessarily use right now, considering that we have fairly shallower waters than what we'll normally see in the North Sea. The bill is reflective of the accompanying fines that I mentioned and convictions for various infractions. The shipping bill addresses some details pertaining to the decommissioning of offshore installations and pipelines within our waters. However, no offshore installation or pipeline decommissioning guidelines has been set as a best practice for the activity. So as I would have mentioned, it's more or less a big stick. It speaks towards the penalties and the fines, but it lacks the area where it guides you as to what should be done, what can be done, and any best practice we may need to bring on. The bill does call for a decommissioning plan, which has to be approved by the Ministry of Energy. That is also inclusive of the Ministry of Transport, Marine Division, and obviously executed in accordance with any written law for the disposal of waste at the sea. And that will fall under the IMO and UNCLOS conventions. So within the shipping bill, there are 6 clauses as it relates to the decommissioning of offshore installations, and obviously the fines and penalties that an operator can face. So this clause 94, it prohibits the decommissioning of offshore installations within Trinidad and Tobago's waters unless registered with the Ministry of Works and Transport, Maritime Division to do so. Failure to comply would result in a $75,000 fine. Clause 96, for decommission of offshore installations and pipelines, the owner of the offshore installations is required to remove all parts of the offshore installation and pipelines when no longer serving its primary purpose. The clause also says that decommission done in part or in whole to be carried out in accordance, again, with any written law of disposal of waste at the sea. And it also calls for the decommission installations manager is required to submit a decommissioning plan to the authorities, which is both the Ministry of Energy and Works and Transport. And again, the failure to comply will result in fines between $400,000 to $700,000. These are all obviously in TT dollars.
Ryan, sorry, do you want us to hold questions to the end, or?
Well, you can hold questions to the end, but if you're open for the discussion, you could more than interject and we can speak to it immediately.
Well, one thing I just kind of blew my eye a little bit was clause 94 seems to be a pretty low fine. Huh? 75,000 seems like a slap on the wrist in a way.
It does, and I think possibly that's the reason why I think it doesn't necessarily stem specifically to offshore installation. So there would also be other ships, for example. So it doesn't only speak specifically to offshore installations. Ships can fall into this category also. Ships of any size, commercial ship, fishing vessels, commercial transportation vessels. So I think the $75,000 fine is really to capture the shipping aspect of it more so than the offshore installations with regards to oil and gas.
Okay.
So the $75,000 in a oil and gas perspective will look like a drop in the bucket. But if it is, we're looking at a man who's operating his trawler, $75,000 for inoperable asset could be a bit of a dent on his pockets.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. So if anybody, as I said, if anybody has any questions, you can more than jump in. It's a discussion that we're having. Clause 97. Should the owner of an offshore installation or pipeline intends to decommission, it is required to notify the Ministry of Works and Transport and the Ministry of Energy. Failure to acquire the approval is a shipping violation and a resultant fine of $30,000. So again, another drop in the bucket. But as I mentioned, it is also encapsulating the shipping aspect of it, not just the offshore oil and gas aspect of it. Clause 98 within the shipping bill, the decommissioning of offshore installations must be in compliance with any written law and guidelines. And these are where we have our international frameworks, the IMO and UNCLOS conventions with regards to the decommissioning of offshore assets. The clause 99, where should there be no communication or information provided to the necessary regulatory bodies about the decommission activity, the owner of the offshore installation can possibly face a fine ranging between $10,000 to $50,000. Again, another drop in the bucket, and it begs the question: if there's no communication or information provided, how do we go about finding these folks to charge them these fines? How do we go about penalizing them? How do we go about contacting them, finding them, and executing a warrant to capture these fines and convictions?
That's a good point there, I'm not really cutting across here, but it's a very important topic in the sense that I think that we would definitely have to look at any future of some kind of penalty where they'll have a jail term to be served. Because these fines are really very low. And if you think of it, an operator can abandon a well by plugging the casing back to surface as per the MOE, the ministry guidelines, but it doesn't really state that we have to do anything as an operator on the seafloor or the seabed. For a subsea well, you could have annular pressure buildup in the conductor pipe, as well as maybe the 22-inch string or the 18-inch, and there's no provision for tackling that. So basically, you could be leaving a ticking time bomb at the seafloor, and basically telling the government, "Yep, here we did the plug and abandon of the well, and it's all fine."
Yeah, and this is where it ties back to that to the Environmental Act, where there's that gap, that monitoring of the work done is not there. So yes, Colin, you're correct. There are areas where we really need to pay very, very close attention as to how we move after an activity or operation is done. So there are some significant gaps that we need to tackle, and obviously it's always better to tackle these gaps now than when somebody's in the process of actually to begin decommissioning. We do have a couple of years before it starts in Trinidad, but it's better to put the legislation out now as opposed to before things start.
For sure.
So clause 100 to 103, directives given for the requirement of offshore installations manager and their role for decommissioning programs. So essentially, within the act, I didn't go into much detail of it, but even using the verbiage offshore installations manager, an offshore installations manager is on the commissioning side of things. Decommissioning is, and I think this is where this area needs to be highlighted and stand alone from the commissioning to the decommissioning. There are two separate and complete operations. Yes, there may be debate about it being just simply a reversal of the installation. But there are other things that you need to take into consideration with regards to decommission, and it's not just a matter of removing or going backwards as you have implemented a process, but there are things that we need to take into consideration over the time of an operation. Your buildup of norm, which is your naturally occurring radioactive material, the wear and tear of the assets. Some assets may not be in a condition to actually set foot on to remove. So you need to take into consideration how you're going to get something like that done, and you have to look at using a possibly a barge crane, a jack-up rig in some instances. So using the word offshore installations manager is a bit, it's counterintuitive with regards to a decommissioning program. So that is a major area that should be discussed. As I said, the shipping bill is still in debate amongst stakeholders. So it's somewhere there's an area there that can change, that can move to something that's more suitable for a decommissioning program. So our production sharing contracts. Within our production sharing contracts, this is where our regulators would have, put a bulk of the decommissioning responsibility on operators and license holders. So this is where you will find a lot of the robust interpretation of offshore decommissioning and abandonment. One of the most critical elements within the production sharing contract is the establishment of an interest-bearing escrow account in the name of the minister at obviously a reputable financial institution and approved by the minister. The main purpose of the escrow account obviously is for financing of decommission of a decommission project. If there's any environmental issues, it's that they move to that area, those funds to execute any remedial work that needs to be done. And essentially it is the buffer with regards to if someone is to essentially, if they lose quick capability of being able to afford to decommission an asset, that the funds within that escrow account is then thereby used by the minister. So as I would have mentioned, where the license holder fails to establish a said escrow account to the adequacy of the minister, he may revoke the license of the holder. The only entity that, well, obviously what we have line of sight of right now, who has international, well, public finances that we are privy to, I would have seen is the establishment of escrow accounts specifically for Heritage Petroleum. As to what the sum may be, it can be debatable as to if it is enough or if it's not enough, but it's a step in the right direction. Okay, within 60 days of cessation of production, the license holder shall commence a decommissioning program to the minister's satisfaction. This is obviously taking into consideration putting things in place and approaching the minister with all the necessary documentation that needs to be done in order for a decommissioning program to commence. The license holder and contractor shall submit 5 years prior to cessation of production the proposed plan for decommission and abandonment I would have mentioned before. There are a lot of research and development of documentation that needs to go into a decommissioning program before it's actually approved by our regulators or by regulators on a whole.
Ryan, you are on mute.
Sorry about that. Not sure what that happened. You can hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so as I would have mentioned, there are a lot of things that needs to go into place before we have a decommission and abandonment program started up. The comparative assessment is a critical piece of documentation that is done by the license holder and the operator, essentially giving the scoping and the screening process and the execution of a decommissioning plan. So jumping further into the production sharing contract, in the event of that an escrow account, or the escrow amount, sorry, is insufficient, the contractor is obviously then, well, I don't want to say obviously, but the contractor is then responsible to pay for the excess costs for the decommission of the asset. Should the ministry decide to have an installation or facility delivered in working condition, the escrow amount is transferred to the ministry, and the contractor is no longer responsible for decommissioning. That area is a bit of that, to me, that raises a bit of a red flag with regards to removal of responsibility of decommissioning. And this is where that, as I would have mentioned before, the robust nature of our Petroleum Act can speak towards someone or an entity still owning some responsibility for decommissioning, because, as I mentioned, decommissioning is a very, very costly operation. It's obviously dependent on the assets, the amount of assets that you have, the infrastructure, the size, the weight, the amount of pipelines and the amount of wells, sorry, that needs to be plugged and abandoned. So there are a lot of aspects within there that needs to be taken into consideration, because as Colin would have mentioned earlier with regards to plug and abandonment, the way how this is mentioned, if it is, we have all the wells to plug and abandon, and you move to simply acquire or to simply transfer the ownership of an installation or facility, then we are left with the entire cost of the plug and abandonment operation. Where the licensee fulfills an obligation in respect to, obviously, environmental remediation, abandonment of wells, decommission, they did everything to T. The minister, upon determination of the license, is thereby responsible for, shall return the existing funds in the escrow account to the licensee. So it's more or less, how I interpret this, it more or less looks as if the burden is still placed on the minister, on the ministry, and that's something that I think, yeah.
I have a question regarding, could you explain a little more this second point? I think it's confusing. So it's saying is that, let's say a licensee, an operator decides to plug all their wells. The wells are part of a platform. And the next step will be to decommission and cut the platform completely. And let's say for a reason, let's say the ministry decides that they want to repurpose that platform for, let's say, wind farm. I'm just saying something.
Yeah, that's fine.
Right? Then the amount that the operator had put in the escrow account to cut the platform will pass to the ministry, and also the liability to whatever happened to that platform.
Correct. So even before we get to the plug and abandonment of your wells, if the ministry decides to have the installations and the facilities, they did specifically say delivered in working condition. So let's just say, for instance, as you mentioned, a repurposing of the asset for wind or maybe hydrogen production, offshore hydrogen production. The responsibility is no longer falls on that operator. The responsibility then falls on the ministry. Now, there's no mention as to if it's prior, during, or after the plug and abandonment of wells. So there's that gray area that needs to be addressed also. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And I guess to follow up on Celia's question, and maybe have this a bit confused, Ryan, but I remember reading in some areas, I believe in the UK, is one that even if you, as an operator, sell your assets to a company that maybe doesn't have as deep pockets as you,
Yeah.
that they can still be called upon to support the decommissioning at the end of the phase if the operator that they've sold to doesn't have the funds to do it. Is that correct? Is that some?
That is correct. So we more or less see a lot of there's a lot of third generation operations that's been happening between the UK. So you'll see Shell and Exxon, BP selling a lot of their assets to smaller operators throughout the North Sea. And the onus is there's still some responsibility that falls on the shoulders of these major mid majors as opposed to just leaving the opportunity, as opposed to just leaving the responsibility on the shoulders of the smaller third generation operator. Now, the third generation operator is coming to squeeze out that last barrel. Now, they do take into consideration the cost to decommission the asset, but because the UK has a very robust decommission regulations, they know that they can still get support from that initial major entity who would have sold the asset to them, or the entity may still have some share percentage within the field, within the license itself. So they will still earn some form of revenue from the field, irrespective of them moving the ownership and the major operatorship to that small entity. So you're absolutely correct. The UK still requires you to have ownership and responsibility even after you have sold that asset or move along from that asset.
But that's not something that we in Trinidad do.
And and that is one of the things that we really need to discuss as to how we get that in place. I know it's going to be a bit of a battle, obviously, because as I said, decommissioning is a very expensive, it's costly. In doing project economics in the past, I would have looked at, there was always the discussion as to, do we put the decommissioning in as a part of our capital, as our analysis? Do we leave it out? Do we show a project with decommissioning, or do we show a project without decommissioning? So it's always a big debate, and it is going to be a debate moving forward, because we've seen, for example, the Tiksaman Pui field would have changed hands probably 3 times over the last 40 years or so, 45 years, from Amoco, BP, Repsol, Perenco. So that's four times. Right. So we need to pay close attention to that, and I guess that has to do with the business development aspect of things with regards to the new entity who's now owning the asset, as to what relationship they have, or what relationship they would have built and developed with the entity that would have sold to them, that the entity that sold still has some ownership and responsibility in regards to decommissioning the asset. And obviously, another big thing that's within the UK is as we all know, the UK are very, very strong, and they are very strong entities in the United Kingdom and in North Sea, well, all in North, I should say, with regards to taxes, government. Essentially, they speak a lot to who is responsible for decommissioning. And in reading the rhetoric that we have, if the minister pays back into an escrow account to the licensee, then technically, who is actually paying for the decommissioning? It's technically the taxpayer. So these are little areas that we need to pay close attention to, because it's a big area of contention in the UK. We know Greenpeace is on top of every offshore asset in the UK, and unfortunately, we don't have a Greenpeace in Trinidad. But
Sorry. Sorry, Ryan. Christian here. Can you explain your reason with respect to how the taxpayer would end up paying for the decommissioning with respect to the transfer of fund from the escrow account?
Well, if the minister, if it's coming out, if it's coming out, the way I interpret it, if it's coming out the coffers of the ministry of the minister, then I see it as a taxpayers making that payment. If it's coming from the coffers, no.
But the escrow account, though, the escrow account that you're speaking about is one that's contributed and established and funded by the contractor. That's what
the operator.
About,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Yes. So it's the operator's account, but in the name of the minister.
The minister.
So it's the minister. I believe it is the contractor paying for it, and the minister keeps the funds until the contractor fulfills his obligation. In which case, So
yeah,
I think it's being kept. The contractor is being kept whole by giving him back the funds if he's already paid for the liability.
The contractor will need to get back those funds that they would have put into the escrow. So it is. So
the general public will end up paying for it, which is wrong. So
the escrow account now. So the decommission provision on a financial on a balance sheet or a P&L for example, any one of the entities we have operation right now, decommission is considered a tax deductible of your profits, right? So that's one. So it obviously reduces the taxes that the entity is paying, because obviously it's taken from the revenue. So that is so it's essentially something that can be recouped through taxable deduction, through non-taxable deductions. So this, as I have mentioned, there are a lot of moving parts within it, and to really get to the bottom of it, this is where we need to bring in our, we have our audit companies to really get an idea of the transaction, the movement of the funds, and as Colin would have just mentioned, at the end of it all, if the minister is repaying that escrow sum, it comes to me, to the way we interpret it, it's coming from the taxpayers dollars. All right, so that's good. That's a good discussion around because the intention really is to let us become aware of what is currently in place with regards to decommission. As I mentioned, we don't want to wait until it's a year or 2 years before it's time for decommission an asset, and we are backpedaling as to figuring out why wasn't this done, or why we are still in this hole, or X, Y, and Z.
So Ryan, as we have this conversation, who is responsible for pushing for all these? Is the ministry? It is I don't know, interest groups. It is of course it's not the operators. The operators don't want to discuss this, but who is responsible for this?
Well, I'm actually going to get to that in further on, so we could get.
Okay,
I'll
we can wait for that.
We will move forward. Yeah. All right. So as I mentioned, as per the tax and petroleum profits decommission abandonment cost, as I mentioned, is considered a tax deductible. All right. So as I said, the production sharing contract is the robust regulation that we have in place within Trinidad and Tobago as regards to decommission and well plugging and abandonment. The Environmental Management Act 2000 is our key requirement. The key requirement is the Certificate of Environmental Clearance for Decommissioning Activity, which speak to a lot of aspects within a decommission a decommission program. The legislation more or less will capture what atmospherics, the discharges, environmental protection, and obviously some navigational criteria with regards to the environmental clearance for decommission activity. These are, as I said, these are very, very critical elements that we need to pay very close attention to. I always draw reference to the UK in regards to the UK and the Gulf of Mexico with regards to the environment. These areas are very, very pro-environment. There's been a lot of benthic flora and fauna actually that develops around the legs and the piles of an offshore facility, even on the seabed. So when it comes to the environment, these areas need to be taken, a lot needs to be taken into significant consideration as to the activity that needs to be done to either get the seabed back to some state of what it previously would have been before the project, before installations, or maybe even to leave in place. So within a comparative assessment, there's an area that focuses on the environment, and it speaks towards the scope and the screening as to what can potentially what can damage the life at the seabed, the life that would have accumulated around the legs and the piles of the asset, and obviously the activity that needs to be done to ensure that there is safely a safe action is carried out. So in some instances, we may have a situation where the asset is left, or it is it is the UK, sorry, the Gulf of Mexico is big on the rig to reef programs, simply because there's way too much life, flora and fauna, and if you go into removing the assets, it can cause some significant environmental hazards. So the objective is really just to leave it there, create a reef with significant monitoring. So this is where the Environmental Act, as you would have mentioned earlier, Colin, with regards to rehabilitation and monitoring, it all falls in place with regards to the well plugging and abandonment, and then the assets that may stay in place, or the area that would have had the asset that is now bare. So that is another major area on a decommissioning work breakdown structure that the Environmental Management Act needs to pay very, very close attention to. A lot of the environmental issues obviously would be buoyed significantly by the international environmental frameworks, which we'll get into in the next couple of slides. So jumping into our regional framework, I'm not sure how many people are aware of this, but we are actually a part of the Cartagena Convention. It was developed for the protection and development of marine environment in the wider Caribbean region. It was adopted in 1983, enforced in 1986, and it's supported by three main agreements. One, protocol concerning cooperation in combating oil spills in the wider Caribbean region. Two, the protocol concerning specially protected areas and wildlife in the wider Caribbean. The protocol concerning pollution from land-based sources and activities. The convention run concurrently with the UN environmental agreements and the IMO agreements. And the main focus, as it relates to decommissioning, is pollution that should be caused by seabed activity, pollution caused by dumping, and protection and preservation of rare, fragile benthic habitats. So, as I have mentioned before, the Environmental Act ties directly right back into our us being a part of the Cartagena Convention as ratified members. Our international frameworks. Now, Trinidad and Tobago, we are signatories of 5 major treaties, conventions, and protocols, all with an overriding principle that decommissioning activities should not result in any harm to users of the sea or the environment. So these are, when we say any harm to users of the sea and the environment, we speak specifically to our stakeholders, all our fisheries industry, our sport, our marine sport. These are all aspects that fall under the sea and users of the sea, and our shipping channels also. So ideally, we're going to focus mainly on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and the International Maritime Conventions. The Basel Convention the CITES and the Convention on Biological Diversity more or less tackles what we would have mentioned before with regards to the Cartagena Convention, with regards to environment, and as it relates to operations at the sea. So the United Nations Convention is UNCLOS. It defines the rights and responsibilities of the nations to use the world's oceans, establishing guidelines for businesses, the environment, and the management of marine natural resources. Initially, the Geneva Convention, which was established in 1958, specifically states that any installations which are abandoned or disused must be entirely removed. The Geneva Convention was then superseded by what we'll use now as UNCLOS 3 in 1982. The most significant issues covered were the setting of limits, navigation, archipelagic statuses, and transit regimes throughout EEZs, continental shelf jurisdictions, deep seabed mining, the exploitation regime, protection of the marine environment, scientific research, and settlement disputes. So UNCLOS covers essentially all the elements within a decommissioning program in a very, very broad spectrum. The verbiage really geared towards decommissioning primarily has to address dumping, where dumping is defined as deliberate disposal of waste or other matter from vessel, craft, platforms, or other man-made structures at the sea. And obviously deliberate disposal of vessels, aircraft, platforms, or other man-made structures at sea. So it's essentially the protection of the marine environment in a nutshell. Now, as it relates to offshore assets and infrastructure, there's always been a debate throughout the North and Gulf of Mexico as to where do we draw the line for what we categorize as dumping. You may say that the cutting of a framework and leaving it at the base of the ocean may be considered dumping, while some may argue that is adding to the marine environment. So there's always a gray area with regards to the marine environment as to what we categorize as dumping. The International Maritime Organization existing installations. So this covers for Trinidad and Tobago. This covers one of the most important aspects of what we would have mentioned before in regards to international regulation. So currently, what's in place? Installations within water depths of greater than 75 meters or 100 meters, if installed after the 1st of January 1998, or weighing more than 4,000 tons, can be wholly or partially left in place, provided it is shown that it do not cause unjustifiable interference with other users of the sea. However, there are no exceptions to complete removal where the installation or structure is located in approaches to ports or in straits used for international navigation, in customary deep draught lanes, and IMO adopted routing systems. So there is some legislation as regards to current existing infrastructure that we may have overlooked. Now, if my conversations in the past serve me right, I believe we may have some derelict assets that was previously operated by Tringen, throughout I would say about 25, 30 years ago, maybe. These may be considered as, they don't cause any interference to other sea users, but who is in place to say yes or no? The IMO guidelines require a case-by-case approach to determine such special circumstances where the coastal state may allow an offshore installation or structure or part thereof to remain on the seabed. And this is where this comes into play, where we have the rig to reef programs that's been very popular in the Gulf of Mexico. and also it's some areas of California. So those are areas where obviously the IMO guidelines, as I said, would take into consideration that opportunity and that option, as it's something that would need to be discussed and properly scoped, screened, and assessed within a comparative assessment for decommissioning project. The IMO guidelines do not have the status of international law and are therefore not binding on states. Instead, the IMO guidelines have the status of a recommendation. They impose a general removal principle on coastal states requiring that all disused installations and infrastructures should be entirely removed, except when special circumstances consistent with the IMO guidelines can be shown to apply. So this is a big gray area. It is not law. It's simply a recommendation. It's best practice, but also taken on a case-by-case basis. So to tie back to the questions that we had earlier with regards to who is thereby overseeing and being a watchdog for a lot of these, as you see, there's a lot of moving parts with regard to our decommission program in Trinidad and Tobago. And some of our areas of review and for improvement is the adoption of best practice according to global decommissioning standards. I always use the Oil and Gas UK and the Gulf of Mexico as prime locations where you can find best practice for decommissioning. A committed regulatory repository of the national and regional framework for decommissioning needs to be set in place, because we have to pull a lot of data, a lot of information from a number of different legislature to bring together essentially into one place to have an idea of what needs to be done in Trinidad and Tobago and what is in place for decommissioning within Trinidad and Tobago. An update and review requirements of regulations for decommission of offshore installations and pipelines, ensuring that requirements are of sound analysis and review processes. Tying it right back to what Colin would have mentioned in regards to the monitoring of well plugging and abandonment after a couple of years. Do we have anything in place that can say the semen that was used, has it been compromised over a 10-year period? Who's there to essentially go down and review and monitor these abandoned wells? So it all falls into place, and it all needs to be done and regulated with firm requirements. The implementation of robust pipeline decommission regulation. On an international scale, pipeline decommissioning has some gray matter around there, because there isn't any set methodology for pipeline removal on a global scale. It is all on a subjective case-by-case basis, based on the area of regulation. So the UK, for instance, prime example, being a part of OSPA, they have established pipeline decommissioning, and it gives a very, very firm guideline as to what is required for the decommission of pipelines and the accompanying infrastructure for their pipelines, maybe mattresses, and everything that will be on the seabed that is part of that pipeline infrastructure. A comparative assessment separate from your overall decommission program should also be included as a major ticketing box for pipeline decommissioning. Now, as I said, these are all referenced based on OSPA decision 98.3, which we can all I can easily I can supply you all with those readings, and you'll understand how robust the UK has taken their decommissioning programs, and how seriously they've taken it, because it is, as I said, if not, then there could be some significant implications if left unattended to.
I think that's a very good point there, Ryan, in the sense that from a legal standpoint, there's going to be a lot of pointing fingers if something goes wrong.
Yeah.
And let's say me as a service company were to come in there under contract, and your job is conducted properly, but for some reason, at some point in time later on, a casing leaks or there's a failure at the seafloor or there's washout and you now have gas percolating to the surface. Who is responsible for that? So that is where the tricky part comes in. You can't just say, okay, well, it's the Ministry of Energy and Trinidad and Tobago has to stand the bunks. I think they really have to have a lot of processes and standards and procedures in place that us as a country could mitigate and monitor what is being done or what has been done.
Yeah. So to answer the question I was asked earlier, my suggestion is a consortium of stakeholders operating as a cohesive unit with the sole responsibility of ensuring the planning and execution of offshore decommissioning are met from an environmental and legal standpoint. I think this is a very, very important, and it's as I said, we do have some time to get these actions implemented before we actually do embark on a major decommissioning program. That being said, not assuming that the current operators of the TSP facilities are going to move towards decommissioning within the next couple of years, or may not. But the consortium essentially are all a part of that our environment, our oil and gas environment, from our fisheries to our shipping industry to even our onshore operators. I mean, I've been speaking a lot of offshore, but there is also space for the onshore operators as part of this also, simply because the assets do come into our onshore facilities. Our regulator, our operators, licensees X, Y, and Z. So, it's a lot that needs to get done in order for us to move as a cohesive unit to fully own the responsibility of decommissioning. And it's not just from a corporate side, but it's also from a social responsibility side. And I think that is the most important thing. So we've seen consortiums created for the North Sea through OSPA. There's a consortium created in Scotland, in Aberdeen, that is responsible for decommissioning of the North Sea assets. In Norway, there's a consortium that's been established for something similar. In Australia, there's been established also. And I think it's because Trinidad and Tobago has such a rich history in the industry on a global scale. It would be paramount for us to move towards that direction, to create this consortium and to move to have all our decommission regulatory frameworks properly ratified, reviewed, robustly developed, for us to move forward.
That's a very good point there too, because let's say a new operator wants to come and set up shop in Trinidad, let's say on the West Coast. I would be very apprehensive to come and set up a new platform there amongst all of those existing platforms that have been there since the 1950s. And some have fallen over into the sea, some may not have been capped properly at the seafloor, and then you come in there with your brand new platform, set it down, and something leaks close to your platform, and you get blamed, and you get into a
legal battle. Yeah, exactly.
A legal battle. It's a difficult thing. So all these things, as a new operator, I would be very apprehensive, and that's something that our government needs to look at too, because it could actually be hindering development.
Exactly. And you're correct, Colin. I mean, if it is, we do continue working with. I mean, I don't want to call it archaic, but if you're still working in a space where the decommissioning world is moving towards a particular way of doing business, and we are still holding on to our past, then they're definitely seeing illegal from a legal standpoint. They're thinking this is more of a hazard for us to go in and operate. Forget the money that we're going to make from production, but if something does go wrong, we stand to take a significant hit. That being said, with us venturing into deeper operations and deeper sea operations, I do believe now that is a perfect opportunity for us to really put a stamp on improving what is in place right now for decommissioning. Because if it reaches a point where we're operating at further out to sea, then what happens with our shallow water operations? Is it just neglected, similar to what has happened with our own Trinidad and Trinidad assets down in the west coast? We move from that area to the East Coast Marine area, and if we're going to deeper East Coast Marine area, then we can easily follow suit and neglect those old assets. So it's something that we need to pay very close attention to. Finally, I want to show what I would have mentioned earlier with regards to a work breakdown structure for decommissioning. There are a lot of different segments within the process. From the up, and this is simply for a knowledge of to give the team a understanding of what needs to be conducted in each segment of the work breakdown structure. So from the operator project management, we have a number of different areas that needs to be taken into consideration. And these are all things these are most likely done 5 to 6 years before the actual decommissioning project will start. And it all ties into what we would have mentioned with regards to stakeholder engagement, project management core team, because your cost is going to be significant, and obviously you want to have a competent team executing the decommissioning program. How you report, your closeout, your studies on to support the decommissioning program, your scope, your definitions, and your methods of how you're going to go about decommissioning, and the decisions that you'd have taken to decommission. Your facility running and your owner's costs. These are your logistics, your operations teams, who's going to be the guys who's going to be there supporting your project management team, your deck crew. Now, this is assuming that the assets are obviously still in some state of operationalship. In regards to what I mean by that is that it's not in an extremely derelict state that no one can actually set foot on the platform. And we've actually seen platforms like that in the North Sea where you dare not. It will be an extreme risky, significant hazard if anyone is to set foot on any platform to begin a decommissioning program. So, the timing obviously needs to be critical. Your platform services, integrity, management inspection, which is a very major area with regards to reuse and reutilization of an asset. The operations specialist services, which is primarily for waste management and disposal of norm. And then obviously we have the well abandonment structures, which is this is probably the most costly aspect of the entire decommissioning program. I will show in another presentation eventually what your costs for decommissioning program may look like, and how the well abandonment and plug-in abandonment operation is the big kahuna of a decommissioning program. Because obviously you have to bring in your rigs, you have to do rig upgrades, the amount of wells that needs to be decommissioned, the speed at which you do it, and your duration of how long it will take to get it done, the well project management, the operation support, the specialist services, your conductor recovery, the cleaning and recycling, and then the actual vessel that you're going to be using to carry out the plug-in abandonment. The facilities and pipeline making safe, your topside preparation, your topside removal, and your subsea removal can more or less all be encompassed into one category of the decommissioning program. And that has to do with a lot with your the operations, drainage and flushing and cleaning the areas to make sure that it's vented and safe for your team to execute the decommissioning program. Your engineering, your pipe gauging, and your waste management. The waste management is always something major throughout the entire project, because you're unaware of what would have been accumulated over your years of operations at an offshore facility. The module, if it is your infrastructure is based on a module, or if it's modular, or if it's a single structure, what you do to prep it in order to remove it is critical. You have to do your surveys, obviously your dropped object surveys and your subsequent remedial actions to ensure that you're safe to carry out the activity. And then your actual removal of the top sides, via barge or heavy lift vessel. Obviously that's another incremental, that's another significant cost that comes into a decommissioning program. And then obviously your subsea removal, the actual subsea removal, that's another removal of your risers, your flow lines, the removal of your framework. If you may leave the framework in place, if you may do a full lift of your framework, these all fall in under your substructures removal, your top side and substructure onshore recycling. Now, this is an area where there is, we currently in Trinidad and Tobago, I think we have one where we have TUFCO right now, where they currently do the building of the structures. Something similar for decommission for recycling can be done in Trinidad. So it's maybe opportunity for a private entity or maybe the government to embark on something along those lines. And then obviously your subsea infrastructure removal, which is all your pipelines, your umbilicals, your mattresses, the manifolds, and all the stuff that we'll tend to have as part of your subsea infrastructure and architecture. And then our final two is your site remediation and monitoring, which, as I would have mentioned, is critical. And as Colin rightfully says, where we see the areas where, we may be in a situation where something is not capped properly or something is not removed properly, and it can cause some issues with regards to fishing or regards to environmental hazards. So more or less, your decommissioning work breakdown structure is the Bible, more or less, of what is done with regards to decommissioning. And as I have mentioned, there are a lot of activity that surrounds it, a lot of opportunity and work that needs to be done and that goes into it. And that's why I said it's counterintuitive to have someone as an offshore installations manager be responsible for the decommissioning of an asset. And that is it for me today.
I like how you've put waste management in quite a few of them, because I think overall that's going to be one of the biggest costs because of the risk as well.
Yes.
You could be doing any type of operation for recovery, or any type of job on the platform or on the rig or whatever, but there's always something that you're going to be disposing. And quite a few times you might actually find that some of these platforms or risers may have, other than grout, they could have brines with inhibitors in them, and those could be corrosive. You can have diesel. Sometimes people put diesel in these legs to stabilize them. I mean, you're never sure what type of fluids you're going to bounce up.
And I think another issue is that because what is another big area, another gray area, is the amount of data that is needed for a decommissioning program. I think it's something that's seldom overlooked. If we have had poor data management from the commission aspect of it, or we've lost data management or data over the period of time, 30 years down the road, it is a guessing game. Essentially, you're going into something that you really have no clue as to what you may encounter. So yes, you need to ensure that all safety protocols are taken from a waste management perspective to asset integrity perspective, because as I said, data is lost over a period of time. And when we're looking at assets in Trinidad now, well over operations for over 40 years, it's something that we need to pay very close attention to. Yeah. So if there are any questions, I know there's a lot to digest.
Right, I guess, I mean, a lot of this stuff would kind of rely on the government to jump in and probably change some regulations or implement new ones. How can we as industry kind of push that to make it happen? Honestly, Christian has his hand up afterwards.
So let me answer your question and we'll shoot over to Christian. I think honestly, Adam, it's something that as my last conversation I would have had with an industry stalwart, I like to call him, Anthony Paul. He would have mentioned that what needs to be done is really just for us to really start to get the conversations and the rhetoric out to the ministry for them to get an idea of the. I mean, it is a very big gap and a big hole that we need to fill. Our entities, the SPE, even the Geological Society of Trinidad and Tobago, I think are probably in the best space to start to speak to the government with regards to having them look towards decommission as a major area that we need to pay very close attention to, because I think once we begin to see what the dollar values are with regards to the cost of what it's going to take to decommission some of these assets, it's something that's going to jump out at them. And if they don't take notice of it, then it will really lack responsibility of the government. Christian, you could go ahead.
Hi, Ryan. Very interesting presentation. I don't know if you know, I am a senior petroleum engineer in the ministry, so some of what you're speaking about is familiar to me.
Right.
Yeah. So I wanted to add something to the conversation in terms of the documents that you would have looked at locally. We have a pipeline license. We have a pipeline license that since for the gas infrastructure in Trinidad and Tobago, especially, all new gas pipelines which cross concession boundaries are required to apply for all operators. So most of the trunk pipelines, for instance, have pipeline licenses, and the pipeline license has a provision for the operate for if there's any decommissioning to be or an accident that needs addressing, the minister can cause the works to be done that are needed and bill the contractor for it afterwards, and the provisions for the contractor to hold the minister indemnified against any liabilities that arise from a pipeline and its operation and so on, and certain provisions for revoke of the license. Now, that being said, that everything you said about modernization of the licenses and ENPs, especially, and the petroleum market is noted. Ministry has its strategic planning exercise later this year. I will try and take that on board. I can't promise it'll get the attention it will deserve, because as usually is the case, decommissioning is always the last thought in people's minds. It's usually how you get the money, not how you spend the money at the end,
Yes.
So,
correct.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just one question. With regards to the pipeline, is this for offshore or onshore or both?
So for both, the 40 and 48 inch pipelines have it, the 36 inch that's cross-island pipeline that is owned by NGC, run by BP, that has its Phoenix Park line from Atlantic. So all of the operators have applied for it. Unfortunately, there's an issue with respect to issuing of licenses, but the point is the license is there.
Okay, great. Because I'm thinking this would it have been in place when we would have initially. So who owns? How do we categorize who owns the pipelines that are currently in place that would have been installed, let's say 30, 40 years ago?
Yeah, so if we're speaking about pipelines that would have been put down since the 1990s or so. Actually, no, some of the first cross island pipelines in the 1970s, but prior to that, say the Trinidad infrastructure, even TSP infrastructure, those old pipelines don't have licenses. But the regime started somewhere around the time that the first cross island pipelines from NGC were built.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes.
So there's some space for that, as I mentioned, with regards to you all developing those regulations. As to, I think that may be a significant area of contention in regards to the pipeline. I don't even want to imagine what is at the seabed some of those pipelines right now. But it is, I think that is a critical area that once the ministry is addressing it, as you have mentioned, is very, very important that we move forward with. Thanks, Christian. Any more questions?
All right, guys, if no more questions, I guess last chance for wrap up. All right, I guess on behalf of SP, I really want to thank you, Ryan, for coming on and giving us this technical talk. I think it was very well received, and I got a lot of great feedback already from people online. One thing I would just want to mention to everybody listening now is that if you were interested by this talk, it is Ryan is also going to be joining us for a guest speaker section in the SPTT conference, and we've also been in talks with possibly getting like a workshop made as well. So it is something that I think is very, very important and deserves attention. And I'm really glad to have Mr. Ryan Brown here to give us that and kind of guide us through these conversations as well.
Not a problem, Adam.
Colin, you're muted if you're trying to speak.
I feel like I can't get accustomed to this technology, Thanks a lot, Ryan. I'm much appreciated. It was good to get this insight and information. It opened my eyes, and it kind of starts to help all of us focus on this thing. We all in a country that obviously has a mature, or we are a mature oil field. We've been in the business over 100 years.
Yep.
So yes, obviously now it's time to decommission some of these things safely and cost effectively, where it doesn't affect us and our children's future.
Correct. So the cost, I think, as I said, once we start to see what the cost is like, is when it's going to pique our interest significantly.
It's going to be amazing, the amount of cost. I mean, not just from our operational standpoint. I think the waste management side is going to be one of the biggest, yeah, as you want to call it that, yeah. And what to do with it. You could also have radioactive waste, as you know.
Correct, exactly. So
that's going to be a difficult one, I think.
Yeah, Adam, if anyone wants to get the presentation, I'll send it to you, and you could share it with the team. Also, my contact information if anybody wants to be in contact, and we could have a couple of discussions around different aspects of decommission also.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. And guys, I know they had some people who would have wanted to be part of this conversation as well. And we kind of kept this as a part for the SP members, and it's one of our ways of, I guess, making the membership a little bit sought after. But it is, for the workshop and stuff, we'll look at ways of incorporating others, because I know there was a lot of interest in it. So, all right. Yeah, thanks a lot, Ryan. I really appreciate the time. And thank you for everyone for joining in for one of the technical talks.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Ryan, Adam, and SP for the excellent presentation.
No problem. Thank you very much. All right, folks.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
All right.